Stuart is, if I may say, of an interesting vintage because you are very much part of the film co-op movement in the 1970s. You belong to the London Filmmakers Co-op, which most people here probably hadn't even heard of, but it was an aegis for, well, independent filmmaking, predominantly on 16mm film. And as I remember it, correct me if I'm wrong, you were funded by the Arts Council regularly.
I wouldn't say regularly, no.
But you were producing work regularly right through the 1970s.
Not really, no. I think I was one of the first one of the first filmmakers to actually get a grant from the Arts Council. They used to sort of fund arts documentaries, but they didn't.
Were you seen as a dangerous conservative within the co-op movement for taking money from the man?
From the man, wow, yes, well maybe. But yeah, no, the Arts Council was very good, and so was the BFI at that time, sort of funding people at the London Filmmakers Co-op. And the Co-op was a very good place to work in, and I remember it very clearly from the early 70s. But by 1973 I decided to move out of London, and I moved to Lincoln because, you know, I was doing one of these residencies, you know, that probably everyone here has done at some time in the past. And I stayed up there, and I stayed there too long actually, and I stayed there for about 10 years, doing a bit of...
When you say a residency what exactly?
A residency in filmmaking. I had a filmmaking fellowship, and I was given a little cottage by the Lincolnshire and Humberside Arts Association, so my stipend was funded by the Arts Council and also by the local regional arts authority, and presumably a bit by the BFI. So around that time I was able to get some money from the Arts Council, BFI, and also the Gulbenkian Foundation. But by about 1976 it all ran out, and they decided that I was such a boring so-and-so.
Well, this is Stuart's modesty, which I'll come back to.
It's not.
Do you mind going a bit closer, just because I don't think we'll get the sound very well.
Well, sorry, I'm muffling it all.
You just talk very, very quietly. This is something I tried to bring Stuart up on. I do find he's far too modest about his work, and it's one of the reasons why I do try to.
I'm not modest. I'm not. I'm a very good animator. No, take a bit.
Not an animator.
I'm not an animator at all. Yeah. No, but I think my work today, my work over the last 10 or so years, has improved quite substantially from what I was doing in the past. I think when I was working in the past, back in the 1970s and 1980s, I never took any views from other people. I just thought, I'm going to do it this way. This is the way to do it. It's the first thought, the first sort of idea of doing things. Now, and for the last X years, I've had an executive editor on the team.
Who's that?
She looks at all the work, and she's very, very good. She may not sort of cut any film, she may not know how to cut film or do anything in software or on the computer with regard to sort of video editing, but she looks at something and she'll say, you don't need that bit, or that bit doesn't work so well, and if you took that bit out, all those other bits would come together. And that's very, very useful, and I really appreciate that.
I'm embarrassed now.
No, don't be. And so, that gives me quite a lot more confidence with the work, you see, because even the work that I've just finished, one of which is on a DVD there, which I finished about a week ago. Rosemary looked at it and just said, well, look, this doesn't work, this part of it doesn't work because there's no movement in the frame. And I'm thinking, why the hell didn't I think of that? She thought of it.
You would have done eventually.
I might have done eventually.
Modesty on your part now.
It's one of the. I'm in a writing group, so and we discuss each other's stuff, and it's this thing of it was somebody saying something which you were quietly thinking and wondering if anybody else would say it, and so it's why it's useful to be here and for you to be willing to screen up people's work that's not finished, because that sort of thing happens.
Well, yeah,
somebody points to the thing that doesn't work, and you don't necessarily change it in the way they suggest.
The problem with here though is everyone's far too polite to be too critical. But yes, I am very interested in showing work in progress, so I would be delighted if you wanted to come along and show incomplete films and to try to get a bit of feedback. Can you just say a few words about how you began as a filmmaker?
Right, okay. Let me start. Yeah, I think I got interested in filmmaking because I went to the Poetry Society. It was in Earl's Court. It's not the London Filmmakers Co-op. The London Filmmakers Co-op came later, but it was the Poetry Society where there was a gentleman with the name of Bob Cobbing, which many of you may have come across, who was a sound poet, and he was using tape recorders and making sounds with his voice, and from syllables and bits and pieces of his voice, and he was a very interesting guy to do lectures and get us working. And he also ran a course on visual poetry, and on one of these courses, I think it was a visual poetry course, I met a guy who worked for the BBC. He was an Australian film director who was making music films. And I said, well, look, how do you get into making films? And he just said, well, look, you need a camera, you just go away and do it. And of course I didn't have a camera, and he just said, look, I want to see some commitment from you. Go and buy some 16mm black and white film, which I did. And he said, oh, okay, you can borrow my Bolex camera. So one weekend I had this Bolex camera, it's a little wind-up camera like this. And I went out in the street, and I was filming down Euston Road, and people were stopping and sort of getting out of the way of the camera because they thought I was either doing something. And then I went into...
What year was this?
This is about 1970.
Okay.
Then I went, and because I thought you could just film people in the street. And then I went into Euston Station, and I was filming in Euston Station, and then a British Transport policeman came up to me and just, what you do? Have you got a permit? This person might be out with his girlfriend or with his mistress or something like that. And so I started to get a bit apprehensive about sort of using a camera in public, and so I sort of kind of went in a little bit on myself. But yeah, it sort of started about that time, and also running into people at the Drury Lane Arts Lab. This is around the late 1960s, and they were showing films by Andy Warhol. And I saw this double screen version of Chelsea Girls, and I ran into some people. Dave Curtis and his wife-to-be, Biddy Pepin, and they were sort of working behind the scenes in the cinema there. And so you got to talk to people, and eventually, because I'd sort of had some sort of experience using a film camera, I went to the London Filmmakers Co-op, and by that time I'd bought a camera because I had a very posh job in an oil company. I was a scientific business analyst for the Exxon Corporation.
I thought you were for the Exxon.
Yeah, I was in the Corporate Planning and Economics department.
Oh, nice.
And I left the company, I think they got rid of me after about 5 years. They wanted to move me to the Mathematics, Computers and Systems department, and I didn't want to get too polarised into computing and so forth.